there is a fair few sort of heavyweights in the industry that are pretty naysay about whether you're getting your education or whether you should be giving up your time for nothing. The reality of it is, if pro sport is what you want to do, and well, the reality is you're probably going to have to give up a fair bit of time for free before you get your foot wedged firmly in the door.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. We've had a few weeks hiatus, but I'm very happy to have our next guest here, is the head of sports science for the Manly Seagulls Rugby League Club, Mark Booth. Mark, thanks for coming on, mate.
Thanks for the invite, James.
It's really good to have you fresh off an NRL season. So you guys finished up last week. Unfortunately, the Seagulls were unable to make the finals, but this year, 2020, probably go down in the record books. You've had a few seasons in professional sport. How does this season, the 2020 season, stack up in comparison to the more typical seasons that you've worked?
Oh, it was definitely more demanding once we returned from the lockdown, mostly due to, I would say, staffing restrictions. That was probably what placed the greatest demands on the unit as a whole. Normally we have the luxury of having a pretty full complement of staff, and then probably an intern or two in sort of each discipline to help out with a bit of the day-to-day legwork. But we lost a few of our sort of contractors on the periphery, and then interns were obviously banned, and so it just basically increased everyone's workload. Apart from that, it wasn't too much different. The travel was a different element. Last year, I think we had every single away trip in the NRL. This year, we ended up only travelling twice, and obviously travelling via a charter plane on the day, in and out, presents its own challenges. But surprisingly, a lot of people there wasn't a lot of complaints about it. It was pretty seamless.
Mate, that's really good to hear. Actually, I'm interested about that chartered plane. How did that work? I can understand it would work from just get on the plane and get off the plane, but more so from a recovery and preparation period. Obviously, you said it was a bit more stressful. Was it more stressful because you needed to get the individuals and the boys on the plane and then off the plane, in a short period of time, or was it more stressful from a warm-up, cool-down, recovery perspective?
Probably, I would say just planning the logistics of the day was probably the most difficult element, simply because there were certain times with the bubble and access to stadiums and et cetera, and your clean zones and all those sorts of things. There were certain times we were allowed in and out, and they didn't necessarily line up with the times you could get the charter flight company to book the flights. So we had two trips. We had Townsville and we had Sunshine Coast. Sunshine Coast was pretty seamless in terms of the timings, but Townsville obviously being a longer flight firstly, and then just the timings, the way it was mapped out, we actually had the players there pretty early, and it meant a fair bit of downtime. Now, when you're on an away trip, you basically allow them as much time as they like in the morning at the hotel, or they go for coffees or whatnot. You have a bit of a team activity, and then you time your run to the ground pretty well. But we didn't have that luxury, so we had to sort of plan out a different facility we could take them to, or a room in the stadium, and then we actually had blow-up beds that they could all have a little bit of a lie down on, and players being players, they end up just sitting on their mobile phones for most of the time. So we had to sort of fill in that time, and then there was also you've got to plan all their food, timings of their meals and everything like that around those sorts of things. So the logistics was probably the biggest thing, but I think most people probably preferred it, in all honesty. I didn't really hear any players complaining. What's that?
What makes you say that? What, when you say prefer it, as in prefer that
traveling
on the day? Okay.
Yeah. The The charter flights themselves were awesome. Not having to go through commercial airlines and check in, check out, those sorts of things meant that the trips themselves were much faster. You've got the plane to yourself, so that's a pretty big advantage. Everybody just walks on and finds their own seat. There's plenty of space. Having said that, the refs had to travel with you, which was probably not too pleasant for them. But
especially on the way back home after a few dodgy calls.
We were pretty good. We won in Townsville. We didn't win in Sunshine Coast. You're able to sort of organise your own food for the planes, those sorts of things.
Nice. Okay.
So that in itself was pretty good. A lot of, particularly the staff, will tell you that when you get to the end of a season, if you've had a season like last year where you do, we would have done nearly 10 away trips where you're in hotels for 3-4 days at a time. It stacks up by the end of the year, and everybody's a little bit travel weary. And I think most of the players I spoke to said that they didn't have a problem with it at all either. I think it would be different travelling to New Zealand. I don't think that would be possible, but most of the Australian trips, I think, would be pretty feasible.
Not to harp too much on it, but is that something that you guys are looking to potentially change for, maybe not for next year because you might still have the same problems, but in years to come? Is that feasible for you guys? Have you looked into it?
I think next year it's almost a certainty. The question will be whether the travel bubble is open with New Zealand and potentially the Warriors are able to play from home. I think going beyond that, and I'm only speaking on second, third-hand information here, I think there will be discussions between the NRL and the RLPA around that space. I think it probably works out cheaper for the NRL to do charter flights rather than pay for hotel stays, commercial airlines, etc. It would just come down to what the Players Association deemed was preferable. From a recovery point of view, not too different. Obviously, it's not ideal throwing them on a plane immediately after playing a high-level contact sport like that. But, I mean, going through their junior development systems, they all would have done it multiple times in 20s and those sorts of things. So, not the end of the world. We'll see what they come up with.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they end up going to. But before we get on to you and your journey, another thing that's been popping up is, especially NFL, because the NFL have come back, a ton of injuries, a ton of ACLs. We saw it in the Bundesliga. We saw it a little bit here in our sports. How did you guys go with managing a lot of the players when they returned back from their COVID break, so to speak, and then getting them back in and then managing the injuries from them throughout the season? How did you guys go there?
Oh, look, we definitely had a pretty horror injury toll this year, but we didn't have much luck with injuries last year either. So we can't really blame COVID for that, especially the vast majority of our injuries were all contact-based injuries again, and just the luck of the draw type thing. I know there's been a lot of talk about an increased injury rate in the NRL across the season. I looked at the stats in the middle of the year off the back of an article one of the journos wrote, and to be honest, when you look at, like, they were comparing 2020 to 2018 and sort of saying there'd been a massive jump, and there had been a big jump, but when you look on the year-on-year stats, it was a pretty standard progression. The speed of the game was definitely a little bit quicker this year. I don't think it was as much faster as the media might have it portrayed, but it was definitely a bit faster. Whether that and some of the rule changes play into that, it's hard to say, because it's a little bit counterintuitive, because if it was simply the speed of the game and fatigue-based injuries, then the rise in injuries would be predominantly soft tissue.
Yep.
But the bulk of the increase in the injuries, well, certainly looking at those mid-season stats, again, they were all still contact-based injuries, and that's what you'd sort of expect to see when you've got fresher players coming on with heavier collisions. So for us, the COVID break presented its own logistical challenges in terms of remote training for the players, but we had enough equipment to hand out to the players so that they could look after themselves, provided with a program. We were all able to touch base with them on a daily basis regarding compliance with the program, looking at their wellness and those sorts of things. And we came back out of the break in pretty good nick. We had a couple of really good games. Our issues sort of happened more towards the back end of the season rather than around the COVID break. So I don't think you'll hear anyone from Manly blaming COVID for an underwhelming season.
Be interesting to see what, the more data you have, the better decisions you can make. So, even next year, potentially it won't be the exact same season, but we'll have some sort of interruptions. Be interesting to see how things play out, especially with sports across the globe as well. As you would know, the purpose of this is to look through people's journeys. So we've really had a decent snapshot and understanding of what's happened this year at Manly. But, but the first thing that comes off the page when I take a look at your journey is the wealth of tertiary education qualifications that you have, mate. I'm really interested in your thought processes there and value on education, because just for people at home, we've got a sports science degree, we've got a master's in nutrition and dietetics, we've got a master's in exercise and strength and conditioning, we've got a master's in clinical exercise physiology. And have you finished your PhD yet, or is it still?
No, I submitted. That was the one advantage for me. I was right in the middle of the death throes of preparing my thesis when lockdown occurred. So I actually spent, while a lot of people had a nice refreshing break during April, I spent April glued to a computer 8 hours a day and hammered out the rest of the thesis. And I submitted in May, just after we went back, and then you go through another couple of months of torture with examiners and whatnot. But it was approved actually on my birthday in August. So it was a nice little birthday present. So yeah, I think the testimony and conferral comes out next week, actually. Yeah. But there's no graduations this year, so it's all about censure. Yeah, thank you.
You get the hat in the mail. That's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, look, out of all those other things I did, I only ever went to one graduation anyway. I wasn't really much on the pomp and ceremony of it all.
You and me both.
Yeah, not really my go. In response to your question, I suppose, so I started as a late bloomer too. My tertiary education started as a mature age student around the age of 30. I spent a large portion of my 20s backpacking around Europe, traveling and getting that out of my system. When I came back, I've always trained extensively. Obviously decided I needed to do something with myself. So I quickly nutted out the personal training stuff and built up a PT business. By the time I'd already started that, I'd worked out that it wasn't really enough for me. I played sport in school, but was never particularly gifted as an athlete. But I always followed it keenly. So I thought I'll get in and start studying exercise science. But I was also very interested in nutrition. So at that stage, they don't offer it anymore, but Sydney had a double degree in exercise science and nutrition dietetics. I actually didn't get in on the first cut, even as a mature age. So I had to do a year-long prep course in science and maths. I did that, then ended up going to UNSW to do a first year of exercise science, then got the marks to transfer across into the double degree at Sydney. By the time I'd finished the bachelor, though, and started the Masters of Dietetics, I still had an interest in nutrition, but quickly decided that it was the sort of S&C stuff that had interested me more. I did the level 1 and 2 at ASCA and decided that was something I still wanted to do. So I found the Masters at ECU, and I did that concurrently with the Masters of Dietetics at Sydney. And from there, I think the thought process was always just to develop the most broad-based skill set that I could. It was always as I'd started the Bachelor, I was volunteering as an S&C firstly in basketball at Manly, and then in AFL at Sydney Uni, and then at my first taste in league was in the juniors at Para. I did all of that all the way through my Bachelor, and sort of decided that a lot of S&C work was still getting asked questions about nutrition and sports science and all these sorts of things. So I thought to make myself the best S&C I could, it would be advantageous to study all those other things. And as far as the last two bits of tertiary education, when I did the double degree at USyd, the ESSA had dictated that students could get their accreditation as an exercise physiologist at the end of that degree if they simply completed the 360 clinical hours that are required for exercise physiologist. Throughout those 5 years, they changed the goalposts multiple times. And by the end of it, you needed to do another full year and a half study or something like that, and then make up the hours yourself. And it was a pretty crazy process. But I found the Masters of Ex-Phys at Charles Sturt, and having done obviously when you do S&C in the juniors, you kind of have to be the jack of all trades. You have to sort of provide all the nutritional advice. You have to do all the rehab stuff yourself, obviously in conjunction with the physios, but the physios aren't there 24/7 like they are in an NRL program. So you're kind of the jack of all trades, responsible for everything anyway. So I finished all of that other stuff, and I thought, well, a little bit more knowledge in rehab won't hurt. As for the PhD, it was actually, I look back and I actually, when I applied for it, it was almost as a joke. I never ever expected that I would get accepted for it. I looked up one of my old lecturers, Rhonda, who I knew did a fair bit of work in rugby league. I just looked at what her research interests were. I'd done a little bit of data collection for her and another lecturer in the juniors. And I just went and had a coffee with her and discussed it. And I put in the application and almost forgot about it. I didn't expect that it would be approved. And the next thing it got approved, and I was like, oh, I'm going to have to do this now. So, and then I embarked on that journey.
Bite off more than you can chew and then just keep going, mate. That's really interesting.
Most definitely.
That's really interesting. And especially the commentary that you had about in a sub-elite area or the juniors area, having to be the jack of all trades and seeing, further tertiary education as a way to be obviously that individual who can provide that information. How does the jack of all trades then cross over to the elite? So the skills that you develop there, in your opinion, how does that cross over to when you get into the elite environment?
Well, it's interesting because I've had exposure to a few different development programs, Para, Bulldogs, Manly, also in basketball and AFL, etc. And they vary wildly depending on the resources available to the organisation. A club like Parramatta has it all. So their development program is phenomenal. So they do have reasonably well qualified people in most of those places. They do have enough hands on deck, all that sort of stuff. And then you go to an organisation like the Bulldogs or Manly, and not to disparage either of those, but they just don't have the resources available to them that Parramatta do. And neither do sub-elite basketball clubs or AFL clubs. AFL clubs might now, I don't know, I'm talking 10 years ago. So the level of qualification and skill set of some of the staff there are a lot of volunteers who might have just done their level 1 ASCA, and that's basically all they've ever had a chance to do. So they're sort of basically just your club coaches who are helping out, because that's really all So when you go from well-developed programs to not so well-developed programs and you move into the elite level, obviously at the elite level they've got even clubs that don't have greatly developed junior programs still have a lot of resources at the elite level. So they've kind of got a specialist for each area. And I'm, well, depending on what way you look at it, I'm fortunate or not fortunate enough to have worked across pretty much all of the disciplines at some stage in the elite level. I've worked as the dietitian, I've worked as the sports scientist, I've worked as the S&C. I've done rehab. That was more my rehab exposure, and at the elite level has been more with tactical populations in the police force. But just the specialisation at the elite level, in some ways, having all of those feathers to your cap makes life easier, but it can also hamper you a little bit. If you're thinking of when you apply for jobs, if you're just applying for something that's been sort of advertised, they're probably always only looking at how much skill or how much exposure you've had in a specific skill set, not necessarily how much exposure you've had at a particular level. So it can be almost count against you. Having said that, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, a hell of a lot of the time, a lot of positions are sort of word of mouth and those sorts of things anyway. So on the day-to-day running of an organisation and of a unit, I feel it's more advantageous to myself having all those. So right now I sort of float amongst the different disciplines and have different elements of input on season. And with the sort of major part of my role acting like, I suppose, the right-hand man to the performance manager, having experience and qualifications and all of those skill sets means that when he's got a question about something, I'm generally able to give him a pretty solid answer. Off the back of that, that's probably where my value to him lies, my biggest value to him. And then if there's a problem in a particular area or say this year where we go from having a full complement of staff to losing a whack of those staff, I become a pretty valuable individual because I can step in and take over certain other elements of other roles. So it can count against you if you're sort of just applying for a job out of the blue, but if you're within an environment, then it's definitely advantageous to have a wealth of different skill sets, strings to your bow.
I couldn't rate that answer anymore, mate. That's a fantastic answer. You mentioned some time at New South Wales Police and in the tactical space. I'm really interested in your perspective of that industry. Firstly, your time in that environment, right? Working with a different population, working in a different environment, and any sort of stories about that. But then also the actual your sub-industry that it's becoming. You know, there's a lot more. You see the tactical S&C courses getting promoted. You see a lot more tactical S&C jobs being advertised. You see that kind of niche within a niche industry beginning to grow. So I'm really interested to hear your firstly your thoughts on the time that you spent there, and then the industry itself.
I loved it. Absolutely loved it. They had to pry me away from that job to go to Manly for two reasons. My wife wasn't that keen on me going back into professional sport. They probably didn't help their cause by calling me on my honeymoon to harass me to come and work for them. But I enjoyed the job that much that it took a lot of coercion on their behalf to get me to leave the program in the police force to go back to working in sport. The program I was in was more of a rehab-based job. Having said that, you're working with all of the different sort of subdivisions of the police force. So you spend time with the TOU guys, the tactical operations units, the dog squads, the detectives from every sort of walk, a lot of the general duties guys. I had I had guys like superintendents of drugs and firearms, like assistant commissioners under my care, those sorts of things. So you met everyone from the beat cop right through to the very top brass. They were all really, really lovely, really pleasant, humble people. In a lot of ways, very, very, very appreciative of the time that was given to them through the program, because they don't get that. Once they leave general training, probably where the gap lies in the police is that they don't have a lot of follow-up development for the physical capacities. They've got their certain standards they have to meet. Their standards aren't that high, barring the tactical units and the riot squads and those guys. They obviously have very, very demanding standards. So there's probably an element there. The other really great thing about that job, and that two other things that stand out about it, were the types of injuries you'll come across in the police force are as out there and crazy and varied as your mind can possibly conjure up. That
Tell
being
me
because
some wacky ones.
We had one woman. She had a broken arm from a fall wrestling an offender, and the offender, obviously the old outstretched arm type mechanism, but the offender landed on her and so did her partner. But the crazy thing about the injury was that the way the bone healed, it literally left a triangular hole in the middle of her humerus. So she had this gap in the middle of her bone, which meant that loading the arm was really challenging. There were a lot of the stock standard injuries you got were guys chasing offenders, jumping a fence and landing poorly, twisting the knee or the ankle. You had a lot of car accidents, highway patrol pursuits, those sorts of things, so they can come up with any kind of injury off the back of that. I think the funniest mechanism was the guy from the drug squad who had blown a disc pulling up marijuana plants from a plantation. I think he takes the award for the best mechanism of injury.
How many plants were there?
Thousands. And these guys get sent out. They actually have to go out and camp in the bush for weeks on ends, because some of the crops they are literally that many kilometres into dense scrub that these guys operate in little teams where they'll go out and camp for weeks on end until they find the locations that they're looking for. And then they've still got to get that stuff out of there to bag and tag it before it's destroyed. So that's where the challenge. And he'd been in the squad for a lot of years, so he was starting to get a little bit older, and that sort of told him that his time on that particular rotation was at an end, and it was time to let the younger guys do the legwork for him.
Poor fella, out the bush in the middle of nowhere. Slip disc. Can't imagine anything worse. Poor bloke.
So they had to carry him back as well as the plants, the younger blokes. His back was in a pretty bad way too. It took a little while to get him right. And then there were some pretty gnarly ones where there was some repeated back injuries and some really complex spinal fusions that were definitely going to end their careers on the beat. It was a matter of whether we could get them back to fully functioning, so they could even return to sort of desk-bound duties. There was one woman who had this type of fusion where they basically put a cage around 3 or 4 levels of vertebra, and she had so many complications off the back of that it was pretty crazy. She was with us for a very long time, and the progress was really, really slow, but still very appreciative of the time that the people were thrown in. The other great thing about that role was the level of professionals working in that particular program with the police would, in my view, still be the most elite crew that I've ever worked with. the best communication amongst practitioners, the best support network, the best teamwork, and in terms of the quality of skill set and the knowledge base, they were, in my view, they were the cream of the crop. Very undersung, and great program, because they would come in, they'd get treatment from the physio. Physio would come down, hand over to us, just as they do in a hospital scenario where consultants and doctors are handing over to allied health, and they'd be, okay, today he or she is doing really well, we've worked on this, or they're not doing very well today, probably need to avoid this and this today, we need to regress a bit. So just a all-round an amazing program. And that actually came off the back of the work of one of the guys that works heavily with the Tactical Strength and Conditioning Association, Nick Steerley. He was instrumental in developing the program with an old Bulldogs physio, Steve McCullough, and his younger brother, Robbie, works as the sort of head S&C in it. And I would rate those guys as the best practitioners I've had exposure to, not to disparage them.
So the teamwork that you spoke of and the individuals there, not to discredit the actual individual talent there, but I'm just thinking about the environment that you were in. That environment would be one where there is dire consequences, and you really want to make sure that these individuals can get back to work as quickly as possible. But it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be the same stress level on a day-to-day basis as a professional sporting team. So do you think that the synergies or the teamwork that you were able to create was because of that, little bit of lack of stress on a day-to-day basis, but still you had the same stimulus in a professional sporting environment where it's like, we need to get these people back and ready to serve, but you didn't have the day-to-day chaos of pro sport. What do you accredit that teamwork and synergy to?
I think there's a couple of elements to it. Obviously, in sport, you always do have a head coach breathing down people's necks when there's an injured player. Get him, when's he ready? When's he right? When's he right? So there is, and I have to preface this by saying my current head coach is really good like that. He's not your stereotypical breathing down everyone's neck, as long as he's provided with quality information, evidence-based stuff, he will let people go about their job. But certainly there's still the implied pressure there that we need this guy back sooner rather than later, which you don't have to the same extent in the police force. You do, however, because these people are all on workers' comp, you do have regular liaison with work cover and the insurers regarding. So in a stock standard 12-week program with these guys, we've got plenty of time to get them back to work. But the moment the case becomes slightly more complex, you do have a bit more pressure in terms of when are they going back to work, and depending on the unit they're in with the police as to whether their commanders in those particular units will apply pressure. So, for example, if they're a highly specialised unit like riot squad or tactical, there will be a little bit of pressure from police commanders in those disciplines saying, can we get them back? Can we get them back? Maybe not so much the beat cops. So, yeah, there is that. I think the other element that probably sticks out is you have the luxury in the police force of one-to-one exposure with the individual, which you'll never have the luxury of in professional sport, unless you're working in an individual professional sport. But in team sports, obviously, you've got large groups of individuals and you'll always have to manage your time around those individuals, which is a luxury you have at the police, where you get one person for an allotted amount of time to work on them. So the coaching is probably at a higher level from that point of view. But I will say the synergy between those practitioners was still the best I've come across, because there's a bit of an ethos there about where you park your ego. And it doesn't matter how hard people try in professional sport. That's just not the case. Part of that probably comes from the insecurity of work in the professional sporting environment too. Nobody's fault. It's the nature of the beast, but the reality of it is, in a performance-driven environment, everybody's always looking over their shoulder regarding the security of their employment. I mean, God knows my performance manager, Donnie, and myself are always joking about the fact that well, if we have another year next year like this year, then, you know, we're both on job seeker. So it's that sort of insecurity, I think, feeds a little bit of the ego that you'll find in professional sport that isn't present in, certainly not in that particular program with the police force. Yeah, so there's a lot of elements to that, but certainly the heat you'll get from a head coach, the fact that you don't get one-to-one time with the athletes very often in pro sport, those two things are huge. Yeah.
Oh, mate, I couldn't agree more. And actually, one of the reasons why I had about 2 years as an S&C coach, and one of the reasons, that was probably one of the reasons why when a role in sports technology came up, I went, yeah, I don't know, because I'm a competitive bugger, but I'm not someone who likes to have a pissing contest every day. So there was a conflict for me, and I'm like, yeah, you know, I still got to be able to work in sport, but obviously sport tech. Not to say I won't go back, but yeah, that kind of rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. So it's great to hear that doesn't exist, or it didn't exist inside of that unit. You mentioned Donnie and the team and the network and the head coach that you have there. I did want to ask you about the network, because it seems like you guys have quite a tight-knit group there. You've spent some time with Des at the Bulldogs, from my understanding as well. And I did want to talk to you about the value of a network. Not to say, you know, I guess it can kind of come off the wrong way where you say that you almost gel together, but I think that's a good thing. I don't think that it's a bad thing to have people in the industry that you trust and you want to work with. And when they get a new role as a head coach, they're able to be able to bring the team together. I feel like there's too much of a negative connotation around that. I think it's fantastic to be able to have a group of people that you trust and who are looking after you, especially in the industry like you spoke of, where, you know, you're constantly looking over your shoulder at a possible axing. What do you have to say about the value of a network and the network that you guys have there?
Yeah, again, many answers to that question. I do a little bit of teaching at uni, just casual stuff whenever I'm sort of asked, as long as the powers that be allow me to juggle that. And the first thing, if I'm exposed to first year students in particular, the first thing I always say is the number one thing you need to do is, not to blow my own trumpet, but exactly what I did, and that is, in year one of your degree, two things. If you're not a regular exerciser and trainer yourself, get in the gym and start practicing what you preach and doing all of the things that you're learning about, because if you're ever going to sit with an athlete or a general population, anyone, and try to get maximum effort out of them, if you've never done it yourself, well then, if you've got no idea what a wind gate feels like, then you can't be sitting there screaming at someone to try and get the best out of them. They'll see through that right away. But more importantly, building the network and get out there. And the reality of it is, and there's a really big thing. There's a lot of senior S&C coaches out there at the moment really ragging on tertiary education and really bagging on internships and guys volunteering and all this sort of stuff. But the simple maths of the equation is that you've got X amount of professional sporting organisations in a small country. Each uni is churning out X amount of graduates every single year, and even outside of the universities, the ASCA and the AWF and all these other bodies that run educational courses are churning out people as well, that all clearly have a keen interest in those areas and would not all of them. Some would idolise and glamorise working in pro sport or even amateur sport at institution level or whatnot. So the simple maths is that with that many people, I think one of the guys at Sydney told me that ACU have a cohort of about 350 exercise science students per year. That's one uni. And I think Sydney have something like 250 physio students every single year. So look at the number of people coming out every year with their piece of paper, but the number of organisations never changes, really. So you've got to build a network and you've got to get experience. And the only way to do that is generally volunteer at grassroots level in your local club or whatever. So I always say to guys, whatever your favourite sport is, whether it's basketball, whether it's rugby league, whether it's rugby union, whatever it is, soccer, go to your local club, volunteer with the under sixes if need be, but generally speaking from your sort of under 12s, 13s, once they go into that sort of more developmental stages, they're always screaming out for sports trainers, for volunteers, that sort of stuff. So I say get in and do like a Sports Medicine Australia level 1 course so you can do a bit of strapping and run on the field and that sort of give water and those sorts of things. And local clubs are always screaming out for those sorts of volunteers. You probably only have to give up 2 nights a week or something like that, but it's a start and you'll meet people. And my very first S&C gig was volunteering as a basketball S&C with Manly Warringah, and that came about because one of my PT clients was coaching the junior league side, but the ABA side, which is the feeder to the Sydney Flames, was Brad Dalton, a 2-time Olympian. So automatically, bang, I met some pretty influential people in basketball. Spent a couple of years with them, and then in all honesty, I completely forget how I met them, but I met 2 women involved with Sydney Uni AFL and then the New South Wales Women's AFL side. And they sounded me out about coming and doing some work with them. Again, it was voluntary, but it was only a couple of nights a week. And I went and the thing about those levels too is the athletes are so appreciative of anything that you throw at them, and they soak things up like a sponge. And so through the woman at Sydney Uni, I met the woman at New South Wales AFL. And then my time at Para came about simply by, I actually did a rugby league coaching course, just the level 1 one, went and spent $80 and a weekend just learning about rugby league coaching. And my motivation for that was simply see if they've got any drills for me, coaching drills or anything like that the coaches like to use. And one of the speakers there was Tony Wignall, who was running the under-20s program at the Eels at the time. And I said, and it was just at the time that I was starting, I think maybe my second year at uni, and I was like, I'm going to need to do some hours for uni at some stage. Is there any way I can come down and just put out cones of training, observe or whatever? And then he said, mate, just drop me an email to remind me, and then rang me the next day and said, do you want to be the S&C for the Harold Mats? And I went, well, sweet. So jumped in and did a few years in the juniors there, and then went up to the 20s with Para and was obviously there exposed to the NRL guys. And from there, I had done my sports dietitians course at the Institute of Sport with Greg Shaw and Greg Cox and Louise Burke. And just through 4 days at the Institute of Sport doing the sports dietitians course, there's a fair bit of banter between me and the 2 Gregs because they knew at the time that I was working with Para, and obviously all big Raiders fans down there. They bought me a Raiders beanie as I left the course. But fast forward a year, and Greg Shaw had been talking to Alan Thompson from the Bulldogs, and Alan was like, oh, look, we need a sports dietitian. Do you know anyone? And my name was the first one that came to Greg Shaw's mind, and he said, give Mark a call. So although my time had ended, in my view, prematurely at Para. I got a phone call within a week. I'd been speaking to my PhD supervisor, Rhonda, about potentially teeing something up at the Roosters to take my project from Para to the Roosters. Had a meeting lined up with the Roosters, but before I even got to that meeting, I had a phone call from the Bulldogs going, can you come in and meet with Des? And then met with Des and then spent 2 years there doing, I didn't really do any S&C there, but I did sports dietetics and sports science with them because they were looking for a sports scientist and knowing that I was doing a PhD, which was heavily GPS involved, they were like, all right, well, here you go. And then, so then fast forward from there and I when all of our time was up at the Bulldogs together, we're all showing the door. I was looking around for a job and Mick Steely, who I had met running the tactical strength and conditioning course several years prior, gives me a buzz and says, cops are looking for an S&C, go and apply. Applied, ended up there, and then from there, that's where the network, well, obviously it had already kicked in, but it truly kicked in where I'm on my honeymoon and Des has got his contract sorted out at Manly and he's run Donny, and then he's all right, Donny, build your crew, and Donny's, well, the first man I want is Mark. So I'm getting multiple phone calls from both Des and Donny while I'm on my honeymoon going, all right, what's it going to take to get you to leave the cops? So a bit of toing and throwing, and then I came back and gave the cops a week notice because I got back, I think, on the 27th of October and we started pre-season on the 5th of November and that was it. So the network is, I place a really high importance on tertiary education, unlike there are some people who don't place as great an importance on it. It's certainly a pretty hot topic in the industry at the moment. But it's 50-50 between that and the network. If you're not building the network at the same time and you finish the tertiary education with the piece of paper, I'm not going to say the piece of paper is meaningless, but it won't carry the weight with the kind of guys that run performance units and stuff like that. The really good ones are going to place an equal weighting to the knowledge you have and the experience you've got. So someone like Donny, for example, will look at the qualifications and the knowledge base you've got, but he'll also look to see whether you've had exposure to athletes. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in rugby league, but if you've just sort of sat in uni and idled yourself away and not really bothered to get out there amongst it, he's probably not going to look at your application. So it's crucial. And the way networks work, that's exactly the way they work. You sort of leave one area and then guys that you've met in other areas totally unrelated will be talking to guys you don't even know yet. And then conversations are always being had that you're not aware of. And if you don't have a network, then you're not in those conversations.
And mate, the networks can come off universities as well. Like there's no reason why you can't form a relationship. Like, it wasn't necessarily at university, but you're at a course and form those relationships with the Raiders people. So I think that's commonly kind of lost as well, is the relationships that can be built at university with lecturers or other people that are studying and graduating at the same time.
I try to keep a really good, I'll admit, I don't have a lot of contact with the guys from ECU. Every now and again, I'll basically throw Sophia Nymphius or someone like that an email when I've got a question about something that I biomechanical or force plate related. I'll send her or Rob Newton an email, but that'll be about it. I still have heavy contact with the guys at University of Sydney, though, obviously, because that's where I was doing the PhD. And we always run a bit of an internship program where we try to get one or two guys in each discipline, and we try to get guys that are there that will be able to give us an entire season. So they can really walk away and say, I've seen an entire year of how a performance unit runs at the top level. I've seen everything from, testing in day one of preseason right through to game day prep and what the sheds look like after a heavy loss, which a lot of sort of internships, they might be like 8 or 12 weeks of just putting out cones in pre-season and then that's it, see you later. We don't really need you anymore, whereas we sort of try to make sure that we get them game day accreditation so they can be in the sheds with us and they get the whole game day experience. And we try to get a couple in each space so we don't place a great time demand on them. They're still able to study and they're still able to work part-time. So I typically sort of go, in pre-season, if you can give me, 2 or 3 mornings a week, and then in season, if you can give me 1 or 2 mornings a week, and then between yourselves, you guys choose which games you want to go to. Obviously, they don't go to away games. And the thing is, I always access my contacts at USID and then some contacts at ACU and say, send me the guys that you think will be a good fit. Will thoroughly enjoy the experience. Won't be wallflowers who are overawed by professional athletes or get squashed by big scary footballers, and are dedicated enough to see out a full year. And the thing about that is that, so if I think of the guys that we had at the Bulldogs, so one of them's gone on and he's doing some physio work at the Bulldogs. One of them went on and he jumped into another short internship at GWS and then got some work at GWS. Another guy resurfaced at Manly a couple of years later, working with doing some physio with the 20s. Of the guys that we've had at Manly last year, one of the girls ended up slotting into a part-time role with us at Manly. One of the guys, he went away, went back to the Gold Coast, did a little bit of teaching. Now he's talking to my PhD supervisor about doing a PhD. So he's sort of staying in the network. This year was a little bit different because as soon as lockdown occurred, those guys were removed from our bubble. So it's unfortunate they kind of got the pre-season exposure, and then the moment the good stuff rolled around, they were excluded from it. Which is really unfortunate and what we try to avoid. But, 2 of those guys have already sort of contacted me and said, is there any chance of sort of coming back next year? And I try to always never roll them over into a second year because I feel like that is taking the piss a little bit. There'll be a bit of a question mark on this year. I can see where they're coming from. They want to stay with a foot in the door in the industry. They want to stay connected. They didn't really get the full year last year, but I'd hate for them to start up again this year, do another pre-season and then get excluded from the season proper. So we'll have some conversations around there. But, those guys have all been exposed to myself and heavily to Donnie. Yep. And now they've got. I'm only a little bit player. I'm a nothing in the industry, but Donnie Singe is almost like an Academy Award winner in professional sport. If people who don't know Donnie aren't worth knowing, pretty much. That's not just rugby league circles. That's he's a celebrity walking down the streets of Narrabeen. So in terms of contacts and connections, and that stretches across the ditch as well. If you go to New Zealand on an away trip with him, it's the same story. His phone never stops ringing from people involved in Super 15, from the military in New Zealand, because that's where he started. So if you've had exposure to him and he's seen the way you operate and you've got his seal of approval, well then you've got a network you don't even know about yet.
Your name's up in other conversations you don't even know, as you alluded to before, mate.
Yeah, I know of these are all really young guys, these sort of interns that I'm talking about. They're all still, very early 20s, but in the back of his head, when he's having conversations with people and sort of junior roles come up, there's their foot in the door because he's going to go, yep, I've got a guy for you, Billy, I've got a guy for you, Hugh, and those sorts of guys, they're not aware of it, but they've already made a little bit of a mark. And without that bit of volunteer work that a lot of people sort of decry as being exploitation, Well, they don't have that. They don't have that voice. They don't have that automatic reference that they're not even aware they have.
And it's
So,
not like
yeah,
it's,
the
it's
network
not
is
like
just crucial.
it's not the S&C, the head S&C coach's fault that there's no budget. Like, I can see how you can make. I can see how you can make the point. Oh yeah, you're not fighting hard enough. But like, it's such a larger discussion around. You know, do you want to give every single S&C program across the professional, semi-professional, the volunteer space some coin for doing the role? It doesn't happen at a coaching level, but certainly doesn't happen at a normal coaching level. So yeah, it becomes a bit tough. Mate, I said it would be 20 to 40 minutes, and we've nearly come up on the hour. But because the only reason why I want to cut it off is I'm sure those dogs need to get fed. But mate, is there anything else that you wanted to get off your chest? That normally I ask a question at the end about advice, but that last 20 minutes was basically perfect advice for people coming into the industry. Is there anything else you wanted to get off your chest? Anything else you wanted to say?
Oh, I'd just say, as I touched on earlier, there is a fair few sort of heavyweights in the industry that are pretty naysay about whether you're getting your education or whether you should be giving up your time for nothing. The reality of it is, if pro sport is what you want to do, and pro sport isn't the be all and end all, yourself works in a nice area of the industry that's and I mean, even from my point of view, there's avenues open in tertiary education as an educator as well. You don't have to just do sports science and exercise science and S&C and then claw your way into pro sport. But if that's really what your hunger and desire is, well, the reality is you're probably going to have to give up a fair bit of time for free before you get your foot wedged firmly in the door. Be prepared for a hell of a lot of knockbacks. Be prepared to deal with ego. If you're not, then it's probably not the right place for you. And do it, I suppose, while you're young and can sort of go with the flow of insecure work, because there's going to be ups and downs, there's going to be setbacks, and if you're sort of older and more set like I was, then it's probably a little bit harder when the insecurity of the work comes along to sort of knock you on your feet. But if it's really what you want to do, then sort of go for it, and don't let those sort of voices of derision tell you that you shouldn't be getting an education and that you shouldn't be doing any volunteer work, because it's literally, that is the pathway. And I don't know of anyone that works in the industry that didn't follow that pathway. Some didn't get the tertiary education until later. They were lucky enough to start working in the industry first, but that came about through volunteer work and networking. They still gave away a lot of free time. And nowadays, I just don't know that you're even getting your foot in the door without the tertiary education, as well as the hours of the legwork, the volunteer work. Yeah.
Mark, Mark, I can't thank you enough, mate. I really appreciate you coming on. Really appreciate you sharing your story and sharing a lot of thoughts on history as well. It's been a blast. For those that want to watch our last interview, you can click up there. Not Mark and I's last interview, my last interview. That's up there. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you can click down there. For Mark and James, thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers, James.